Well, we want to welcome on to the program today William H. Murray, and Bill is going to be talking to us today about security in the cloud. Good morning, Bill.
Good morning, Joe. Last week I spoke to you from Seattle where I keynoted Secure World Expo. At the end of my talk, I got just one question. I was asked about security in the cloud. I responded by telling the story of one of IBM's aborted forays into the network service provider business. At the time, IBM operated one of the world's largest enterprise networks, much of it on its own circuits, some of it on leased circuits. As part of the offering that IBM was making, IBM published a security manual. The first half of the manual described the security properties, functions, features, and controls that IBM had built into the network for the protection of customers' data and users. The second half of the manual described how IBM expected the customer to use the functions, features, and controls to protect itself, its users, and their data, and not so coincidentally, IBM from data breaches. For example, the first half of the manual described the controls for management to use to enroll users and for users to identify and authenticate themselves when using the network. The second half of the manual said, please enroll each and every user. Do not let users share identifiers. The first half said, we will render you a report of all usage by user. The second half said, please reconcile that report to authorized and actual users or usage, note any variances, and take necessary corrective action. The manual constituted the service level agreement between the network provider, IBM, and its customers. Now let's face it, in IT, we are not good at writing, much less using SLAs. We're even worse in security. After my talk, I spoke to John O'Leary at the coffee break. And John said what he was going to talk about that day was security and its relationship to its customer. He said, in security, we rarely even know who our customer is, much less do we know how to serve them and how to measure our service to them. Yet the SLA is the key to measuring security. That is, the ability to recognize its presence or its absence. Lord Kelvin told us, if you cannot measure something, you can't tell whether it's there or not. Now, while the enterprise may never outsource its core IT, for many applications and services, the cloud is so highly competitive with buying and operating one's own hardware and software as to be irresistible. Almost every enterprise is going to use some service in the cloud. The ability to write and use SLAs will become a key skill of every security manager and security executive. In the short run, and for commodity services, we should look to what the vendor says about security. We should prefer those that say things that are responsive to our needs. We should avoid any that are silent. In the long run, expect to find and use a carefully crafted set of nested service level agreements. Remember that a vendor that offers you a cloud-based application service may be using at least some cloud-based services from others. The security of your application may rely upon database services from a second vendor, and file level services from a third, and storage network services from yet another. A recent report on government computer use of the cloud by government included concern about the ability to audit as the subheadline. The subheadline said, government executives are concerned that if they use services in the cloud, they may lose the ability to audit those. Well, it turns out this is simply a matter of contract. Our contracts must specify the right to audit. Now, let's suppose the service provider has 100 customers. We don't want 100 different auditors running around in the customer performing audits. That's clearly not efficient. It probably isn't even effective. So better than a contract provision that permits you to audit the service directly is a provision for a service audit. It spreads the cost of any audit over all of the users of the service and limits the number of auditors that the service provider has to cope with at any given point in time. The auditing industry standard for such an audit is called SAS 70. If you're not familiar with SAS 70, see Wikipedia. The Wikipedia coverage of SAS 70 is excellent. Now, there are two types of SAS 70 audits, Type 1 and Type 2. A SAS 70 Type 1 requires the auditor to opine on whether all of the controls that the service provider asserts are actually in place. Now notice, if he doesn't claim any security controls, then the Type 1 is pretty easy to do. Type 2 requires the auditor to opine on the effectiveness of those controls, at least at the time of the audit. Now, we've seen all of these situations arise recently where enterprises thought they were compliant with DSS. They actually had an opinion from a qualified analyst to say that they were compliant with DSS, only to find out that that's just for a point in time. It's just for the point in time when the analyst is in there. A SAS 70, therefore, is not a silver bullet, but it is essential. Before an enterprise decides to rely upon any cloud service for applications, at least those that affect the books of the account, the health of the business, or the customer relationship, it should review the latest service auditor report for that service provider. That's before you enter into a contract. Any agreement to use such a cloud service should provide for at least an annual service auditor report. In many cases, we're going to have to require quarterly reports. A Type 2 report will enumerate the controls that the service provider relies upon. It will opine on the effectiveness of those controls. It's still going to be up to you to decide upon the adequacy of those controls for your environment and for your application. It will still be up to you to capture your requirements in a measurable service level agreement with every one of your service providers. Now, I admit that it's easier for me to tell you what to do than it is for you to learn to do it. But that's why you get paid the big bucks. See you next week.
Oh, that was good.